Yeah, so we're going to have a pretty extensive lecture. Hey, if it's a discussion, that's great. I hope you guys are willing to just discuss with me about the labor market, labor supply, labor demand, the concept of marginal revenue product. Sometimes it's just called marginal product. Sometimes it's called marginal revenue product. Yeah, I sort of prefer marginal revenue product. It's like a little reminder that says, actually, we're talking about this in terms of dollars, not in terms of how many widgets you create, but how much dollars do you bring in? That's called marginal revenue product. And then once we have that, I think these other three issues, immigration, paid leave, and minimum wage, can be discussed and evaluated relative to this maybe free market ideal of just let businesses hire however they want, let workers work however they want. Wages will be determined according to the free market. Hours will be determined according to the free market. So open borders and closed borders is a slightly different question. I think that's a question of how large do we want the pool of labor supply to be? Should labor supply include only native workers, people who were born and live here in the United States? Or should labor supply include international workers too, who could, in theory, they could move here and work here? And that has a different effect. That has a different, not effect, but outcome that you would predict given the market. So hopefully we'll be able to get through this today. It's already 2:20. Less than an hour from now, we'll end the class, and we'll have. I'd like you to have an idea of what labor demand and labor supply are. I've already spoken about it in this class, but let's be a little bit more formal today, if you don't mind. So I do have a slide about this. And my first slide is, where do wages come from? And actually, I'd love for this to be a discussion, and there could be someone who's already knows the answer. Everything I'm going to say today, they know. And I could just simply ask this one question: where do wages come from? And they could give me a complete answer that makes my whole lecture seem kind of pointless, because they already know the answer. I still want to go through the lecture, because it's sort of it's revealing, and how we get to that answer is important too, not just what's the answer. And also, when we have a discussion, if you're willing to answer this question, your thoughts, question mark, you don't have to do it in terms of economics. You can do it in terms of like your own experiences in life. A lot of you have jobs, right? And you have a wage, or do you have a salary? Even if you have a salary, you can sort of think of it as a wage. If you're a salaried employee, I'm a salaried employee. I get paid. I don't have to keep track of how many hours I work, but in theory, you could calculate it. You could go back and see, what's my wage per hour? Actually, I've never done that. I don't know what my wage per hour is. But whether you're wage or salary, if you're working, you have a wage. And my question is, where did that come from? How was this wage determined? Does anybody want to give me just their experience of where it came from? I want to know from somebody who has a job or had in the past. Go ahead, Nick, if you're willing to share.
So I've had a few different kinds of work experiences. Most of my experience has been in the restaurant industry, which I guess is kind of a completely different animal. But for the jobs that I've had that were not primarily like tip-based income, in my experience, usually the employers will, like when I was lifeguarding, there was like some competition in terms of wages between two of the major firms in the area. Like the first place I looked at was offering me $6.55 an hour. This is back when that was the minimum wage. And then the second place offered me $7 an hour. So even though it was only a 45 cent an hour difference, I decided to go that way.
So can I interrupt you? You said 655 and 7. Where did those numbers come from? Did you suggest them? Did they just say, hey, what happened?
I mean, because of the supply of labor for lifeguarding in that area was so high, they were essentially able to dictate a price. And
So
at
they,
that point in time, the one that was just like, we'll give you minimum wage, which
yeah,
was $6.55,
yeah.
because they knew that whether they paid someone $6.55 an hour or $12 an hour, they were going to be able to fill all the positions. So
Okay. Yeah. So basically, in that case, the lifeguarding case, it came from the firm. Was it a public institution or private?
no, these are both private contractors.
Private contractors said, we're going to pay you the least we possibly can. That's minimum wage. And it's sort of take it or leave it. That's where it
Yeah.
came from. That's where the wage came from. The minimum wage law essentially determined what your wage would be in this case. And you as a worker probably just said, well, okay, fine, I'll have to take it, because it's not like I'm going to expect to get any more doing the same job somewhere else, because like you said, you said there was a high supply, people willing to do it. Yeah, that's good. So that's like where it came from. I'll put this in here. Came from minimum. Oh, I don't want blue, but it came from minimum wage. Minimum wage, and sort of take it or leave it from your employer.
Yeah. And
Okay.
the second firm offered like a slightly higher wage. So they were, I guess, maybe they were a newer firm. So I guess maybe they were trying to siphon off some of the labor force from the other contractor.
Did it work? Did you go with the other?
I mean, a lot of the people I worked with were originally from the minimum wage firm. So I guess in that sense it worked, and they were able to get more experienced employees for an extra 45 cents an hour in terms of cost for them.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It's still kind of close to the minimum wage though.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difference of almost nothing.
Oh, what happened? Spirit. Oh, there we go. Okay, you want to go to Philip? I think he's been waiting to give an answer here.
Yeah, so my past two jobs were completely different. My first one was I did landscaping, which I didn't like. If some people like it, it was not me. My current one, though, I work at Costco, and my wage, I think when I started out, was 14, and the minimum at the company raised to 15. But the minimum wage keeps getting raised at Costco because it's partially unionized through contract negotiations, and like we have a yearly raise usually. Like my store's not unionized, but as a whole, there are parts of Costco that are unionized. So universally, every year we get a cost of living raise, and that's through negotiations between the union and the company executives. So that's where my wage comes from, and then I get my wage gets raised I think it's every 1,000 hours. I get another raised up to the maximum, which I think is 26 to 27.
Are those automatic raises?
Yes, based on how many hours you get.
Okay, so you have like an automatic starting salary that's determined partially by the union. Yes. And then you have these sort of automatic raises. So you don't actually have to go and negotiate for your wage. It sort of happens automatically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Anybody else want to kind of explain where the wages come from? Anybody actually have to bargain and negotiate?
Oh, I didn't have to bargain or negotiate for mine, but mine was weird because I worked at a summer camp and they had a book full of charts, and that was how they determined your wage. Ooh, like how many years experience you had, or like how many years you worked there. And then that was like it. And nobody ever really got any more money, even if there was people there who had been working for like 30 years at this camp. They were still getting like a certain wage that I felt like was probably pretty low, but because they were, I don't know, like teachers, and they like worked in like childcare facilities like for the rest of the year, they didn't really seem to mind, since it was just like a summer side job.
It's a giant book of wages.
Yeah, it was really
Did you ever think about where those wages come from? Like, where did they come up with these numbers in their giant book?
I mean, I guess that they were doing it based off like the perceived number of campers that they had, and like the amount of work that they perceived it took to take care of a group of kids. Like,
were they thinking about whether or not the wages would be accepted, or were they just kind of assuming that we can fill as many positions as we want?
I feel like they were kind of just assuming they could fill as many positions as they wanted because
Okay.
it's a camp with high turnover anyway.
Yeah.
So it
Okay.
never seemed like there was a shortage of people to work there.
Right, right. I mean, doesn't that really matter? You could think of a world where anytime you have a position open, you can fill it because people are going to just apply like crazy. Or you could imagine a world where you could have a position open and nobody's applying for it. At least nobody qualified that you would be willing to hire. Those two worlds are very different for you if you're trying to run a company. And that has a big effect on wages, doesn't it? It kind of sounds like in all three of these cases, Nick's case, Philip's case, Dorian's case, that the firms weren't really worried about filling their positions. However, it sounds like with Costco, they give you what I would consider to be pretty competitive wage there, the $15 per hour. It's in fact, that's what the Democrats want to make a federal minimum wage laws of $15 per hour.
It's a pretty progressive company. Like it's very, it gets rated pretty highly usually by its employees.
Yeah. So Costco has an interest in not just giving people the smallest wage they could and have them still work there. They're actually choosing to give a wage which might be considered above the competitive wage in order to make their employees happy and invested just to want to stay. There's all kinds of reasons why you might do this. All of this goes into where wages come from. I think it's really interesting. But most of our experiences probably though have to do, we're coming from a labor market where it's probably better to be hiring than to be looking. Like there's more applicants than there are positions, probably. Even though I have to say, I don't know what it's like where you guys live, but in Chesterfield County, where I live, every restaurant, every fast food, quick service restaurant has a now hiring sign after. And it's really hard, I think, for them to fill these positions, especially late shifts. So I've noticed that if you want food in this around me after 8 p.m., you're just like not going to get it. I think I tried it once to go to I think it was a fast food restaurant, and like I pulled into it was drive-through only, and it just stopped. There was no movement. It was like 20 minutes of just sitting. I don't know. I forget how long I just sat there, but I realized there was no progress being made, and I just drove away. And I really think it's because there's a shortage of labor, in particular for the type of hours that people don't want to work, which is later than your normal hours. A lot of times that goes to kids. Kids are willing to work these sorts of hours. When I say kids, young adults. And I think now kids today aren't as interested in working those sorts of jobs because they're not fun. They don't enjoy doing this. And if you're someone who lives comfortably with your parents and you don't need extra money, why would you take a job that you don't enjoy doing? And I think because of that, there really is like a shortage of labor for that particular industry. I know that there's other places where it's the opposite, right? So it's like, it really depends on the type of job. It could be, there's some things that you get 100 applications and there's only 5 spots available. So like, it's really competitive. And so it's kind of weird. I can't say whether which type of the market we're in right now, but that's my. So yeah, this is good. You could also imagine somebody who negotiates for their wage a little bit, right? It seems like none of the 3 people who shared their experiences had to do that. But when you could imagine yourself doing that, negotiating some stuff for a wage, you're probably thinking about what's the least that I would accept. if somebody offers you, let's talk about salaries now. Okay, my wife was in this situation that I know I have a job at VCU and she's a lawyer, and she actually had a really good job as a lawyer here in Richmond. She was making more money than I was as a professor, but she didn't like the job. I hope she's okay with me telling you this story. I don't know if she's listening from or in the other room, but she didn't like her job and wanted to get in a different one. But she always had the option of staying at her current position. So when she was interviewing, there really was sort of like a minimum salary for her, that if this new job doesn't offer at least this minimum salary, she's not going to take it. So, and of course, the place where she was, I'm not going to say where she was interviewing, but they had a sort of maximum, didn't they? They had a maximum, like, we can't pay you more than this because, you know, we don't have the funds, and, you know, it just, you're not bringing in enough money to make it worth paying you more than this. So there's this range. There's this range of wages or salaries where it's above her minimum, the least she would be willing to take. Sometimes that's called a reservation wage. You heard this term before? It's like reservation price, but instead of price, it's wage. Reservation price is the most you'd be willing to pay for a product. Reservation wage is the least you'd be willing to accept as a wage. Oh, that was weird. Just kind of slow down.
Question.
Go ahead.
Wouldn't that be the same as in like an auction, putting a reserve on the minimum price?
Yeah, it's very similar. I'm getting a call from the Virginia vaccination thing, but I've already signed up for a vaccination, so I don't know why they would need to call me. Yeah, I guess I'm important enough to get a vaccination in Virginia. I don't know why. Sorry. Okay, Joseph made not a question, but a comment that this concept of a reservation wage is sort of similar to a reservation, or what's it called in auctions? The least you'd be willing to sell it for. Is it also called a reservation price?
I think it's called a reserve.
Reserve price? Yeah, that sounds right. You can do this on an auction like eBay. You can, you know, you're selling, you know, a souvenir bobblehead, and you don't want to sell it for less than $20. So you can put that in eBay, that there's a reserve price of $20. And yeah, it is similar to that. It's basically just like, it's right on the edge of where you would prefer to sell it versus keep it. Reservation wages, you're right on the edge of where you would be willing to accept this job or not. It kind of sounds like in your three cases, Nick, Philip, Dorian, you sort of wanted to work. You were willing to work at the price, you know, I said the price, but the wage, because you wanted the money, and it wasn't like you were either going to do this or something else, and you're kind of saying, do you have enough? Are you going to pay me enough to make it worth it for me to do this thing? You sort of knew you wanted to do the thing, and then it was just a matter of determining the price. But you could imagine in general, with more time and more options, that you really do have a reservation wage, that somehow that this is important to you, the least you'd be willing to accept to work there. I would argue that the three of you, Nick, Philip, Dorian, actually you did have a reservation wage. There was a price under which you would not have worked as a lifeguard, or at Costco, or it was at a camp, I think. But it happened to be that the wage they offered you was above that. So this is sort of like the minimum, I would say. Where do wages come from? Well, there's this concept of reservation. What's the least I'd be willing to accept? But then there's this, the most. What is the most that they'd be willing to give you? Well, it depends on how valuable you are to them, doesn't it? That's what's determining it. It was behind all of this stuff. The lifeguards who were trying to decide whether to hire Nick, they said, well, we'll give him the minimum wage. It's pretty low. but they wouldn't have even given him the minimum wage if he wasn't providing a valuable service for them, which is to sit and watch over swimmers. You know, the swimmers are paying money to swim, and the firm couldn't be making the money off the swimmers unless they had lifeguards. So actually Nick provided this service that helped make this firm money. If they didn't have the lifeguard, they couldn't make this money. So I predict that the amount of money he brought in was actually well over the minimum wage, like per hour. Every hour that he worked, he helped the firm bring in maybe $100 worth of revenue because of all the swimmers that were being watched. Whereas they didn't have to pay him that much. They didn't have to pay him the maximum that he brought in. But still it was there. It was still there as like, this is the concept of marginal. Should I say revenue product or just product? You guys care? What do you prefer? Marginal revenue product or just marginal product? You don't care. I'll go with revenue. Did somebody chat an answer to this question? Marginal product revenue, that's not one of the choices. Are you trolling me? Yeah. Marginal product revenue sounds weird to me, and it's definitely foreign, but that's the maximum. It's the maximum. Okay, so even in all three of these cases, there was this dance going on between, you're not even going to accept an employment contract unless it's above the reservation wage, above or equal to, and below or equal to the marginal revenue product, where this is defined as like the most they'd be willing to pay, the most money that, no, the exact amount of money that you bring in on the margin. Having one more person there, which is you, helps them by how much? Marginal revenue product. In some places you'll just see marginal product, but that could be confusing because sometimes marginal product refers to the extra quantity that you produce. You see the difference? Like, you know, like let's say you work at a pizza. I keep going back to pizza because my kid's favorite place to eat in all of Richmond is a place called Blaze Pizza, which is this sort of like, you go down the line and tell them what toppings you want on your pizza, and then they put it in an oven and it cooks actually pretty quickly, thus the name Blaze. And you know, each worker there is providing a service. It's like an assembly line. And actually the faster they do it, the more people get through the line. And I'm assuming the more revenue that the firm makes. So each person is actually providing revenue for the firm. And so the question is, okay, I'm sorry, what am I talking about now? Like how many more pizzas? So if I said marginal product, if I took out the revenue and just said marginal product, excuse me, that would be thinking, how many more pizzas can I produce per hour if I add one more person to that assembly line? You guys ever go to Blaze? the first person gets your pizza and puts sauce and cheese on it, and that's it. And then the next person puts veggies or meat products on it, and that's it. And then the next person takes your pizza and puts it in the oven. They sort of split it up there, that sort of three-way process. But if they didn't have 3 workers, if they only had 2 workers, then the same person would have to do 2 of those tasks. And that would slow the process down. So when we think about marginal product, without the word revenue, just marginal product, you're thinking of how many more pizzas per hour can this assembly line produce when they have 3 people working as opposed to only 2 people working. I have like a little video, I guess I'd like to show you that'll make this a little more clear. But just for now, I think it makes sense. I actually, before the pandemic, we would go to Blaze like once a week or once every other week or something. We went a lot. We got a lot of reward points. They're called flames, or what the reward points are called. Free advertising for Blaze. But you could think of marginal product as that extra number. Like if 2 people could make, they could probably make a lot of pizzas per hour, 100 pizzas per hour. Could they do that many? I don't know, 60 pizzas per hour with just 2 people. But with 3 people, they could make 80 pizzas per hour, right? So it's sort of like, it goes from 60 to 80. That means the marginal product of that third person on the assembly line of pizzas is 20 pizzas per hour. That's what we would call the marginal product. Now, what's the marginal revenue product? The marginal revenue product is what's the dollar value of those extra pizzas that they produce. Not just, you don't just necessarily take the amount of pizzas and multiply it by the price. It also has to depend on whether or not there's demand for those pizzas. Isn't that interesting? So it's not just, okay, you produce 20 more pizzas, take that they cost like $8 each. So take 20 pizzas times $8 is $160. That's your marginal revenue product. Actually, no, because, and economists are aware of this fact, and they figure it in with their calculations. The quantity produced by a firm can only be sold to consumers according to the demand for that product. In other words, once you've met the demand for this product, you can't sell anymore. And there's generally an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So in other words, so it's complicated when you're talking about how quickly you do something, because does that really affect demand? Maybe it does, because if you're the type of person who might look and see there's a long line at Blaze, I'm going to go somewhere else. Then you become part of this issue. But let's ignore that for now. Let's talk about marginal revenue product. The fact that the third person on the assembly line of pizzas can go from making 60 per hour to 80 per hour, and that's an extra 20 pizzas per hour, that only gets included in your marginal revenue product if you're able to sell those 20 pizzas. If you are, then it's 20 times 8, $160 per hour. Whoa, that's high. You think a pizza worker is really producing $160 per hour worth of marginal revenue? That seems really high. I think I must have miscalculated something. You know what I did? It's the revenue part. It's the demand part. That's what we got. That's what we got to think of. It's not just how much faster do you produce the pizzas, but are you able to produce pizzas that will then be sold by somebody, to consumers? Is there a line of consumers waiting for this pizza that by giving it to them faster, you're actually increasing the demand? So all of that is factored into marginal revenue product. And that's why, in my opinion, it's a little better of a concept than marginal product. The difference is that the word revenue is in there to indicate, yes, we're talking about dollars, not pizzas. And we're only including them if the demand is there for people to actually buy that thing. Okay. So this kind of what I'm thinking of. But once again, this doesn't really, let's go back to the initial question, which is, where do wages come from? I've told you a minimum and a maximum, and that's somewhere in between these two. That still doesn't say where they come from. Where in between the two do they come from? In our three cases, it really came from the firm. The business decided what to do. And sometimes workers can negotiate a little bit, but I think this is probably pretty accurate. It was true for me. At VCU, I did not negotiate my salary at all. They gave me an offer, I accepted it. I still think on all of these cases, my case and the three cases from this on the screen now, there was a market force that was behind it all, that was thinking of not just this one person, how badly do I want this one person, but how many other people are there that's willing to accept this job? We talked about that. And also, how many other businesses are there that would be interested in hiring this person? And now we can think of the pressure of supply and demand that would affect where between this we should think of this as a range. Wages are somewhere in this range Where in that range, it's determined by the market forces. Either there's a lot of people hiring, okay, that's going to press the wages up, isn't it? A lot of people are hiring, not a lot of people who want the job in that particular industry. That's going to push the wages up. The opposite, not a lot of people hiring, but a lot of people applying. That's going to push the wages down, but they still will never go below a reservation wage or above a marginal revenue product. Okay. I meant for this to be more of a discussion, but geez, it was just me talking the whole time. Sorry, guys. You must be bored of me. Can I clear all my drawings? What did I say here in terms of my next examples from your life? Oh yeah, I actually got, you already gave me the examples from your life. Ooh, here's my next discussion question. Why do NFL players get more than first grade teachers? What do you guys think?
Bring in more revenue.
I suppose you're right.
And like they get more endorsements from Nike, Adidas, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So go ahead.
As I say, I feel like when you're looking at something like the NFL, there are budgetary constraints from the employer, whereas the NFL can bring in as much money as it can possibly earn. School teachers are usually paid out of state and local budgets, so they have like a finite amount of funding that they're working with, and it doesn't matter who the teacher is because they're not going to bring in additional revenue relative to another teacher, whereas in the NFL, you know, that can certainly be the case depending on what player you're looking at bringing in.
Yeah. I think we already had this discussion. Somebody brought up Dak Prescott as somebody who's overpaid. And that may be true for this one particular case, but I think there's multiple things going on here. You guys kind of talked about it, but I don't think it's that we value the NFL more than primary school education in this country. It kind of seems like that on the surface. And if you've never studied economics, you know, and somebody asks this question to you, your response might be, America is messed up. You know, our values are just completely backward because we think the NFL is really important and we love watching the Super Bowl, but we don't value our own children's education. So we just live in a completely screwed up, messed up country. I think that's missing some of the reality. And that is this concept of on the margin, right? That I was talking about marginal revenue product, not product, not how valuable is this service. That's actually not part of the things that I had on the screen and what I'm saying wages come from. It's about how much more does this one person provide over not having this one person? How much more extra value? Imagine if there were no teachers anywhere, and all of our kids had to stay home, being homeschooled because it didn't exist. A school system, a public school system where you could send your kids to school didn't exist. It would be extremely valuable for us to have this school system, wouldn't it? The benefit to society would be enormous because it's a way for kids to get educated. It's a way for parents to be able to go work during the day instead of stay home and homeschool their kids. It's like more efficient to do this, to say, not instead of having one person be the teacher for one kid, we could have one person be the teacher for 25 kids. That's a more efficient way to educate in our society. At least you could argue that. Some people might disagree with that, and therefore the total benefit of this teaching is way higher than the NFL. It's not even close. I mean, you might say, great, the NFL provides us with some entertainment. We like watching people who are really good at sports, playing sports. Wow, it's already 2:54. I'm talking a lot. But that doesn't mean we value the NFL more than we value public education. It just doesn't mean that. Rather, it's a function of how the market, in its natural sense, creates these wages based on the marginal revenue product of each individual person, not the whole system, not the whole system of teachers, just one teacher. How much more benefit to a school does one teacher provide? And that's what their marginal revenue product is. You could think of it, my kids go to middle school. That's how old I am. I have kids in middle school. You guys are actually closer in age to my kids than me, I think. But that's okay. So what, I'm old. You'll be old someday too. In their middle school classes, there's like, 20, 30 people. If for some reason you took that same middle school and removed the teacher, said, sorry, teacher, you're fired, what would happen? Would all the kids have to go home because there's no, well, it's the pandemic, so they're already from home, and now it's like half and half. It's a weird time to be alive and have kids who are going to school. But what would happen was the class sizes would get larger. That's the impact of one marginal teacher. Hiring one more teacher means instead of having average class sizes of 25, now we can have average class sizes of 24 or 23. That's it. And the market, if there is a market, I mean, obviously it comes from public funds, comes from taxpayer funds, but still there's these market forces behind it. Even in the public sector, you got to admit there's these market forces behind it. Because you simply can't pay people more than they're worth and continue on forever. It would be, it would be bad. So, okay, that's one answer to this. So you might think of it as a conundrum that NFL players get more than first grade teachers. It's that each person is evaluated on their marginal contribution to the product, and that is, I don't know who the highest paid NFL player was, but no, I think of Mahomes as Patrick Mahomes as being somebody who single-handedly provides so much extra benefit to his team, that having him on your team makes you so much better, and therefore your team generates more revenue, and his marginal revenue product is enormous. I mean, I'm not sure, people might say Tom Brady's better, but Tom Brady went to Michigan, so I don't like him. But I like Patrick Mahomes. He just seems obviously like an excellent football player. And okay, so just looking at that one person in isolation, you can see his wages are a lot higher. So because of his marginal impact, as opposed to the marginal impact of one teacher. That's one comment. The other comment is on the supply and how many people could possibly do what they do. And actually there's a lot more people who could do and who would be willing to be a first grade teacher than who could do and would be willing to do what an NFL player does. It's just so much more of a specialized skill that these two effects are pushing up and up and up and up and up the wage of NFL players, and they are not increasing at all the wages of first grade teachers. I don't believe that means we value them more as a society. Now, you could argue, should we have more in our society to support people who choose to be teachers? I think the answer to that is yes. I think the answer to that is yes, because they provide a very valuable service. All sorts of workers that, I think the pandemic, this is me editorializing a little bit, but the pandemic has showed us that there's certain workers out there who we deem to be essential. We call them essential workers, but their pay does not reflect this. Their pay does not reflect the fact that they seem to be essential. And do I think we need to upend the market and say, okay, now NFL players have to be paid the same as essential workers? I don't think that. I'm sorry. I'm a moderate economist, so I don't think that this sort of revolution would be good for anyone. But I do think we should do all that we can to support those people who are in those industries in other ways. And it could be benefits, just they earn a lot of benefits from taxpayer funded programs. I would support that, but I wouldn't support changing the labor economics of the entire country to get that. So I don't know. That's my answer to this dot. You guys agree with me? Do you have any other comments about this dot?
Yeah, because you can't really pay a teacher or a essential worker $5 million a year.
Well, if they brought in that much revenue, you could.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, if by having this one teacher, your school, so revenue is weird when you're talking about public services, but if they brought in the equivalent of millions of dollars per year of public services, then it would be worth it for us as a society to raise the taxes and pay that person that much.
Okay.
It just turns out though, on the margin, any one person does not bring in that much benefit, in my opinion. But your point is well taken, that the current reality is they don't generate that much revenue. Whereas, does anybody know who the highest paid player in football is? Is it? It can't be Dak Prescott, can it? I don't know. Some of you know. I should have looked this up.
I thought it was Mahomes.
Is it Mahomes? Okay, good.
Might be Dak Prescott. I haven't looked at it.
Yeah, no. Somebody just chatted. Jabron just said Mahomes.
We're in
what
between
about-
seasons, so all that's likely to change over the next few months too.
Sure. Yeah. Who was MVP this year? It was like Aaron Rodgers, I think, was MVP. So why isn't he the highest paid player? Okay. Hala had a point. Okay. She sent it direct to me, but it was a comment on the number of players and teachers, and I think that is a reinforcement of what I was saying about the supply. Right? She's really saying there's a really, really large supply of people who can and are willing to be teachers. And there's a much, much, much shorter supply of people who can and are willing to be NFL players, who are good enough to be NFL players. Okay, thank you. I'm going really slow here. I hope you don't mind. Why do CEOs get paid 100 times more than income than their employers? Does this like really anger, piss anybody off? Like stupid, greedy CEOs getting 100 times more than employees. Who do they think they are? I'm curious if anybody feels that way. And I don't want to shame you if you feel that way. But it might be just worth thinking about as like, why does it happen? Do CEOs actually produce? The CEO of General Motors isn't out there actually producing any cars. He's not working the assembly line and putting windshields on and why does he get paid so much? More than it's something like 100 times more income. And it's going up, by the way. Let's talk about the trend. In 1970, it was something like 20 times as much, the CEO versus an average worker. And in 2020, it's over 100 times as much, I forget. So the trend is more extreme. I don't know. This isn't that interesting. You guys if you have any comments, you can say.
And then they get rewarded when they screw up or whatever.
Yeah. So does it bother you, Joseph?
Yes and no. I mean,
Yeah.
Yes, in the terms of they make so much and they do comparatively little, but no, as in, oh yeah, and then when the company says we don't have enough money to pay our workers more, but you can pay them $15 million. But no, in a sense, they're the boss, essentially.
So how about, I shouldn't have asked, like, does it bother you? I should ask, why do you think it's happening? I think that's a more interesting question. Why is CEO pay just continually rising and average worker median income, in real terms is staying roughly the same? Nick has an answer. Do you mind if I read it out loud? Nick? Managers are able to negotiate their own salaries in a way that ordinary workers can't. They also benefit from the fact that it is inherently more difficult to quantify the value of their labor. Okay, so maybe managers are in a sort of particularly unique way to negotiate that workers don't have. Maybe this is an idea like they're less expendable. That if a worker walked in and said, "Hey, I want to be paid $100,000 a year. I'm walking," they would say, "Okay, we'll see you. We'll hire somebody else."
Well, the market, I mean, for CEOs, if I remember, there's probably no less than like 50 pages devoted to this in one of the books that I read about income inequality. But
yeah,
they one of the things with managers is that because it is like a single position, you have to take into account like the value of a substitution. So like if you were to substitute this manager with another manager, what would be the difference in output?
Of
And
course,
that's like borderline impossible to quantify.
of course.
So
Very
that
good
gives
point.
a lot more flexibility in terms of the negotiation of their
Yeah.
compensation. And even then, some of it might be like pretty far removed from anything concrete, like a CEO with big name recognition, just when he gets, named to the position, might shoot stock prices up. And since usually it's the shareholders who vote on the CEO, they might not even be looking at the productivity of the company.
Exactly. We've happened to be living in an environment where like the status really matters for your stock price, the buzz that you create, and that the CEO has actually become a commodity in and of itself, which is a great show on Hulu, by the way, the show in and of itself. But what are they talking about? No, I think Nick hit it nail on the head when he said, how much better are you than the replacement? Same thing applies for football players, right? Patrick Mahomes is so much better than, the next best quarterback you can get off the waiver wire, or, your backup quarterbacks that you could hire. There's a big difference between them. So if you have a CEO who is a commodity, which is so much better than the next best person they can get, it's sort of a winner take all environment where the very best CEOs are the ones perceived as the best, themselves become such a commodity that the demand, think about the supply of this labor. If the name recognition of your CEO is what you're actually buying, there's only one person with that name. Who's that person? So the supply of labor gets shifted way to the left for these guys, way to the left, even between 1970 and now. Much more shrinking supply of the person that you really want to do this job. And that's why their salaries keep going up. It's kind of sad that it's happening, but it's definitely happening. Ooh, wow, this is a long comment. Lack of information causes significant deviation in price. Sure, I agree. I mean, you could say it's a lack of information, or it's asymmetric information, something like that. Yeah. Am I done with this page? Yeah. Do I want to go into this? How about I show real quick a video? Okay, so I wanted to say something about what's called a competitive equilibrium. It sounds fancy, but it's a situation where the quantity supplied of labor at a particular wage is equal to the quantity demand of labor at that wage for a particular market. That's called a competitive equilibrium. It's also called that in a market for goods and services. The same words, competitive equilibrium. So if you remember what it meant for goods and services, it means the same thing in a labor market. There can be multiple equilibrium. Anytime that these two quantities are equal, it's called a competitive equilibrium. And economists tend to believe that these things exist and that they're relevant, but not that we always hit them. We don't always hit the competitive equilibrium. Just because it exists doesn't mean we're currently in that equilibrium. So you might hear economists talk about how we have this inframarginal group of workers who are below the equilibrium margin, or just sort of out of equilibrium effects, because we're not actually where we should be. There's some distortion, there's some manipulation going on that's preventing us from getting to this competitive equilibrium. I just don't want you to think that I think that we're always automatically at the competitive equilibrium. That being said, it would be useful in this class to know what it is. Maybe I'll have you determine it a little bit. At least conceptually, I would like you to be able to determine it. Mathematically, I don't really think this class is about that. I won't make you do it mathematically, but I would like you to know it conceptually. And of course, I have on this next point here, it's where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. Okay, that's easy. But how is the demand curve determined? How is the supply curve determined? That's what the real question is. It's not just Okay, there's the point. I can see it. I can point to it. It's where the two lines cross. The real question is, how are those lines determined to make that point so special, which is called a competitive equilibrium? And I don't think I have quite enough time to go into that very much, but it's going to be what we've already talked about. We've already spoken about, so like a preview of next class is what we'll talk about. I like to have this annotation, it's fun. How is the demand curve determined? The answer to this is going to be marginal revenue product, isn't it? That's the one single answer to this. But we now need to think of it. So demand curve has two dimensions on it. It has quantity and price. And you might say, well, where does price have to come into this? This is MRP, this isn't price. When I say price, I also mean wage. Price and wage are the same. So you have to sort of convert this marginal revenue product into a demand curve, which is, what is the quantity of labor that I would choose to hire at a given wage? It's like a function. It's like a function of wage and its quantity. But it comes from the marginal revenue products. And it's actually pretty simple to say. I just don't have time, but I'll show you next class, or we can watch a video. There's a marginal revolution video that has a good description of this. How is the supply curve determined? Well, this is going to be that concept that we had before, the reservation wage. Reservation wage. You know, it's also sometimes called, what I like to call it is sometimes your outside option. I don't know why I'm going to bother writing this. It's not going to be very legible, even if I do write it. Your outside option is, what's the next best thing I could do if I don't work here? And you guys who were working at like as a lifeguard, you had that in your mind too. You said, yeah, I could work as a lifeguard, or I could do something else. Maybe my outside option is to do nothing. Maybe I would actually rather not work at all. And you might say, well, then I won't have enough money to do this or do this. But okay, that's part of your outside option, is to give up that stuff too. The stuff
That's actually what, yeah, that's actually what made me get out of, because I did do landscaping for a little while, made me get out of landscaping and get into the restaurant industry, was that I was like, the amount of work I'm doing for this pay is not nearly worth what I would be making for doing less work at another job.
Yeah. So these two concepts, and so I would call that your outside option, that you had something else that you would rather do with your time. Let's be honest. You have one life to live. You have 24 hours each day, probably spend 8 hours roughly sleeping. The waking hours of your day, it's up to you to determine what you do with those hours. And you can choose to spend them working for money, or at this job, or at this job, or this job, any job that's willing to hire you and they give you an offer. You could choose among all of those different offers, but you always have another option, which is to not work at all. Everybody has this option. Now, there might be other bad consequences that come with it, but all of that together is what you might call your outside option. It could be that your outside option, if you're in landscaping, is to work as a server in a restaurant, or it could be to be a lifeguard, or it could be to not work at all, or it could be to go to grad school, or undergrad and then grad. Those count as outside options too. And so once we get to that point, we're no longer talking about dollars. We're only talking about utility. And that's okay. So this concept of outside option, it really is just a comparison of utilities. How much utility do I get by working versus not working? And there's a certain wage that is like the lowest you'd be willing to accept in order to make those two options indifferent. That's what your reservation wage becomes. And because of that, so this is quantity. I'm sorry, I should have put a D here for quantity demanded of wage. And this is what determines, with this little squiggly arrow, quantity supplied as a function of wage. That's where it comes from. So I've just boiled down the entire semester of labor economics into this one little chart, and saying this is what economists believe the market pushes us toward the competitive equilibrium, which is the point where the supply curve crosses the demand curve. And those supply curves and demand curves are determined in this way that I've described. And there are always distortions that might keep us away from the competitive equilibrium, like, you know, a pandemic, or minimum wage could be a distortion. Like, oh wait, you have to pay people this much. That's a distortion. Or paid paternity leave, right? There could be people who are like, wait a second, should I pay them this much, knowing that I'm also going to have to pay maternity leave? That's gonna distort my incentives. Okay, so we'll talk about that all stuff later. I think I've used up all my time. Thank you guys for participating. I had a good. Does anybody have any comments? Let's plan on having our quiz not next class, but probably the class after. Okay, so like a week from today. And I'll get through more of these slides. I'd like to show you a little video just because I think those marginal revolution guys are better than me at sort of incorporating visual aids with the lecture. So I might show you that video and ask you to read a little bit, something that I'll put on Blackboard too. But other than that, you know, no homework over the weekend. That's good news. Root for VCU to beat Oregon. And have a good weekend, everybody. Do you guys have any other comments or questions?